So welcome, my name is Stephen Schain, Post-Production Supervisor for CADLearning and Media and Entertainment Content Specialist. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the new features of 3ds Max 2021 and start out with some of the basics. So as of this release, Arnold is now the default renderer. So when you open 3ds Max, Arnold will always be the renderer that's available. You can still use the others. You can still use the art renderer or scanline if you want, and you can continue using those if you're using them for a project. But Arnold is now the default. When you install V-Ray, you can set V-Ray up to be a default renderer with using a maxstart.max file. Also, the installer is updated. I don't have any screenshots of that, unfortunately, but there's a new streamlined installer. It's much easier to use, and it is faster to install and just a much nicer installation than we've had in the past. And anybody who's installed 3ds Max in the past knows what I'm talking about. The install was not as much fun, and I, for one, am very grateful that the install has been updated. So I'm going to start out with now 3ds Max has Python 3 support, so I can run a script, and there are some Python samples that ship with 3ds Max. This is a Python 3 example here. That's just for combining meshes, and I can pick these two and just click combine, and what that will do is just simply combine those meshes into one object. So it just becomes an editable mesh, and I can convert that to an editable poly and work with that as an editable poly. That's just a really simple example of a Python script. Another one is I can come up and let's go to scripting. Let's run another script. Let me run these docking widgets, and you'll see that there's two widgets that are now available, and these are essentially toolbars, but I can use those. So that has an option in there for creating a cylinder. And those toolbars are dockable, and I can turn them on and off just like any other toolbar in 3ds Max. Another thing is there's now support for 24-bit audio. So if you're using high resolution sound in any of your animations, you can use 24-bit high resolution audio. Another new feature, which is really an update of an old feature, is the bake to texture. So in the past, render to texture was a fairly complicated task. So I'll open the old render to texture dialog and bring it in, and you'll see that it's a pretty complicated dialog box, and it took a little while to get to know it. Now with bake to texture, all I have to do is select my object, and I'll come in and remove these, and I'll show you how to add these maps. So I'll select the object, and I will add a diffuse map and let's go with ambient occlusion map. We'll add those in. I can select both at the same time, change the type, let's change that to JPEG. I can also change the image quality or other options. So if I'm using a high dynamic range file, I can adjust the settings for those files, and I can adjust for all the objects that are selected. I can also change the image resolution for the rendered image, and I'm going to make this a little low resolution just so we don't take up a lot of time rendering. There's also the ability to do projection. I'm not going to get too deep into that. That's a whole topic on its own, and we could take 45 minutes just going over bake to texture. So I can now set where these are going to go. I'm going to put these in the render passes folder, and then click bake. It's going to ask me to overwrite the files. I'll go ahead and overwrite them. And it's going to bake these textures using Arnold as the renderer. So you'll see that it's baking those. You get a full preview of what that texture is going to look like. And when I'm done, I can close it. Go into the material editor, and I can look at the diffuse image. So that's the diffuse image that was rendered. I did render a few other maps prior to this, but there's the ambient occlusion, diffuse, normal map, and specular. And I can use a PBR material. We'll get into that in a little while. I can take it and just apply that to this object and make sure that everything is on the right map channel. And that is the texture, and the mapping on this is a little bit off because I changed the mapping between renderings. So let's grab the diffuse, and let's get rid of that and that. And let's grab the ambient occlusion that I rendered. And we can assign that to the ambient occlusion, and we get a nice version of our model, fully rendered and ready to go into any real-time engine that you're going to use. So talking about viewport quality, go ahead and open another scene here. So this is just a simple, small little village, but viewport quality in 3ds Max has been enhanced greatly from release 20 to release 21. I have high quality. This will render almost as well as a final rendering, but right now there's no lighting in the scene. So one thing that has been added, and this is sort of bleeding over into OSL maps, is the ability to add HDR environments. And I'm going to grab that one. So we'll grab an HDR environment. Another new feature in 3ds Max in the Slate Material Editor is all of the materials now are drawn with the Qt Windows environment, and they are much faster. To activate a material, it's a one-click operation instead of 2 clicks. Makes life a little easier. So we'll go to the environment, and I'm going to tie the output of this to the environment and instance it. And what that's going to do is it's going to render the high dynamic range image as part of the viewport now. So what we have is the ability to render a high dynamic range image in the viewport. And if I come up and just do a quick rendering, you'll see that it looks pretty close. Another thing about the viewports is you have some viewport settings that are now per view settings and per view preferences. You can set up presets. There's a preset for high quality, standard, performance, and DirectX mode. The level of quality, I can decrease this to very low if I want something that's going to happen just fast. And notice the flicker that you get. Well, there is a new option here called progressive fade in time. And I can increase that. And what that will do is over time, it will slowly fade in the end result. And instead of having flickering happening all the time, you just get a slow fade. So if I bring the quality up a little higher to, let's say 2, that slow fade keeps it from being annoying. When you're working in the viewport and you're working in a high quality viewport, when you have this down really low and you're changing your camera point of view, every time you release your mouse button, it will start refreshing the scene. So if you bring this fade in time up a little bit, it's much better. You can also turn off the progressive skylight. So if you don't want to use the HDR environment, you can turn that off. You can also turn on and off the shadows and adjust the ambient occlusion. So once I have that set, I can go ahead and close it. Now in the HDR environment, I have the ability to not only adjust the rotation will change the lighting in the scene. I can adjust the exposure. So I can bring that down to -1 and lower the exposure. And you'll see that'll darken it up. I can even bring it down. Let's make it almost like a dusk. And that will adjust the exposure for the whole scene. Another part of this enhancement is the ability to add lights into this. So I'm going to go ahead and take this bus stop. And I'm going to apply the same thing. I'm going to open up the environment. And I will take a new material that is an HDR environment. And we'll grab the small harbor. And we will assign that to the environment map. Now, another thing we can do in the environment map is set a ground projection. So now I can sort of virtually ground the object that I'm looking at. Let's put this on high quality. I can adjust the level of that ground projection. So if I want to adjust the overall height, this is the height of the camera above the ground for the object that took this. So if you're taking a spherical panoramic with a tripod, you can adjust that. And also you'll notice if I pick a different HDR environment, let's say, let's go with the old bus depot, that it changes the lighting. And this is true HDR lighting. I can also blur the background. That will give me a little bit softer lighting. And again, I can go back and change this per view preset, and let's make that a little bit bigger. Another thing that can be done, and this is something that used to take a fairly long time, and that is adding a ground to this. So in the past, this was a little bit of a tedious process, but now if I want to add a ground plane to this, I can drag a matte shadow right onto that material. And if I come up and let's just do Let's make sure we have Arnold as our active shade. And I'll go ahead and open an active shade window. All right, so this is Arnold in active shade directly in the viewport. And you'll see that I'm getting these rendered shadows on the ground from that matte shadow plane. I can also turn the background blur off. I'll speed things up a little bit. So this is a great way to work in the environment. I'm going to go back to high quality, and I'm going to add another HDR, and that is HDR Lights. And I'm going to pick reflective umbrella. Now, what I'm going to do first is open the environment back up. Let's go over there. And I'm going to take this and switch that. And what you'll see is now this environment has a single light as a light source. And I can create a point helper for this light. And as I move this point helper around, I am actually moving an HDR light. And if we go ahead and render that, you'll see that that light is actually illuminating the scene. And that light is simply an HDR light. So if I look at this and I tell it, make it visible to the camera, I can actually see that light in the scene. Now, that's nice to be able to have one light, but what if I want to have more than one light? So now I can go in and pick a second light, create a point helper for that as well. And I can also adjust the exposure and the brightness of those lights. So it's a really nice feature that is added into this version. You can see the preview in the viewport. Right, but where this really shines is in the ability to connect this into the environment map. So I can take this and now instance this in the environment and not only have the environment illuminating the scene, and let's bring the exposure down, but I can have these lights illuminating the scene as well. Let's make sure I render the right view. So now I have those two lights rendered in the environment, as well as the HDR environment background illuminating the scene. And that's all done with texture maps. There's not a single light in this scene at all. Speaking of materials, one thing that has been updated in 3ds Max 2021 is the adoption of the Substance 2 texture. So Substance, if you're not familiar with Substance, Substance is a procedural texture. And I'll just go to the source. So this is the substance source here, and you can see, get an idea of just, these are just the brick textures that are available. And it's a fully procedural. You can download these and use them in your scene. You can also set up materials. So I'm going to create a new material that will apply to this chair. I'll bring in substance. I'll load a substance. I have a couple here that are just some basic. I'll pick this leather fine grain. And what will happen is this will automatically populate with not only the outputs, but also all of the parameters for this leather. And some leathers, I don't know if this one does offhand, but some leathers have presets. So I can pick, let's pick light red damaged. I can double click and that's going to give me that preset. Now, assigning these to a material can be a little bit of a struggle if you have to do it all together. Well, Substance has a menu that I can just pick substance to physical material. And what it does is it automatically assigns the outputs to a physical material. And I can take that and assign it to these objects. So just assign those. And that physical material is going to be previewed in the viewport. Now, the difference between the physical material and, let's say, an OSL shader is, or the substance material and an OSL shader is, a substance material has to be baked before it can be previewed in the viewport. And that baking has a resolution. So if I come over here and pick on, and notice that I'm just clicking once to go back and forth between the two, I can set the resolution for the bake to be higher. And there's also options. So I have a standard width, and then I can also set it up to have different widths and different heights. So I can bake these or just do it at render time. It's usually easier to do it at render time. And you'll see the difference between the quality of the low res versus the high res. So one of the advantages of Substance 2 is it's much, much higher quality, or it's much faster than the original version. So when you load up a Substance texture, the original Substance just took longer. Substance 2 is also developed in Qt for the interface, so it's a faster loading interface. So let's look also at something new in 2021. Our PBR materials are physically based rendered materials. These materials are based on the physical material, but a PBR material is specifically designed for pre-rendered textures. So I'll give you an example. We'll look at, this is the diffuse color for the desk. This is the normal map for the desk. So it defines the bump on the desk using normals. One thing that is also added into 3ds Max 2021, for anybody who uses game engines, if you do use a game engine, there's something called MIC-T-based normal mapping, and it's not something that anybody, unless you're really getting under the hood of things, needs to know what it is or how it works. It's just a more modern version of the normal map, and it works in most game engines nowadays. So I'm going to just attach this, and you'll see as I add these in, I'm going to go ahead first before I start adding those and add this as an environment. And you'll see that I have this set up already as my environment map. And let's go ahead and make this high quality. So as we add these textures into this map, you'll see what happens, right? So this is the metallic map. So I'm going to add that to the metalness. And that will go ahead and update. And you'll see as I rotate around, this is the roughness. So I'm going to apply this to the roughness map. And now you'll see as I rotate around this that it's a much rougher surface, but I am getting reflections on like the door handles. And then I'll add this into the normal map, and that will give me some bumpy textures and a little bit of definition to the surface. So that is the PBR material. There are two types. There's metal and roughness, and then there's specular and glossiness. And the difference is just depending on what maps you're using, whether you're using a metalness and a roughness map or a specular and a glossiness map, that will give you the option for using each of those. So which one you use is based on the maps you have and the real-time engine that you're working with. So let's look at some OSL shaders. We looked at a couple, which are the environment and the lighting. But I want to show you just another application of OSL shaders. And this one in particular is just, it's called a matte cap, and it's not a new shader in particular, but it's a shader that can use color. So this is a new version of a switcher. So if you look at switchers, you have color and numbers, so float values. So a switcher can switch based on an input, any number of, in this case, maps. So here I've got 5 inputs. I'm driving that input using an OSL integer. So that integer value is going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And that is being driven by this slider. So this is wired to this slider. So as I adjust these values, you'll see that that integer is changing. And it is changing the material that's on that object. These are applying a matte cap UV. This is a special type of UV coordinate made for matte caps. Also, another thing about OSL shaders is they have been completely reorganized in 3ds Max 2021. So as you're working through using shaders, the default textures are here, and then there's some just basic textures. There's a new noise material. So if I take, and let's add this Uber noise into bump. And that might take a minute to update. But this Uber noise is a new noise that's available, and you can use different types of noises, adjust the scale, adjust the amount. That's a new shader that's available. There's also a new gradient available. So if I disconnect this and apply this gradient to the base color, I'll wait for that to update. Let's disconnect that for now. So this gradient is just a simple gradient, and I just realized I don't have mapping coordinates on here, so come in and add UV channel. Nope, this is not set up for that. So let's go ahead and move on to projection mapping. So another new shader is a projection mapping shader. And there are 3 projection mapping shaders. One is camera, object, and then spherical. This is using the camera projector, and it's using the physical camera that's in here to project an image into the texture maps that are applied to these objects. So these texture maps are receiving this projection through a color addition. So this is how this needs to be set up to assign it to objects in your scene. But that's a new material or new OSL shader. Another thing that's been updated in 3ds Max 2021 is the file I/O. So the ability to import different objects has not changed. What's changed is the effectiveness and speed of the import. So with SketchUp, one thing that's been done is SketchUp conversion has been not only improved speed-wise, but also the geometry that comes in is now much cleaner. When you brought a SketchUp file into 3ds Max previously, the geometry tended to be a bit messy. And in 3ds Max 2021, the geometry is much cleaner. And you can see that this is just much cleaner geometry. It comes in, the textures are saved. It's a much better file that comes into 3ds Max and much more usable. The same thing goes for Revit files. So in this case, I'm going to link a Revit file. And this is a Revit file from, I believe, Revit 2017. So it's going to upgrade the file so it can import it with the new importer. The Revit files now import with materials and textures and lighting correct. There were times in the past where you would import a Revit file in an older version of 3ds Max and it wouldn't bring in everything properly. So now it brings that in. I'll attach the file. It'll import it. And when it comes in, it's now got textures. And now what I can do is I can go in to the new and improved scene converter. And I have a preset that I created that I use for every file I import into 3ds Max. And this just takes out anything that's legacy, sets the renderer to Arnold, and then converts everything to a physical material. Now, if you're working with other materials, I can take the Autodesk material and apply it to a physical material, or physical material, change it to an Arnold material. I can also convert V-Ray materials now. So I can take a V-Ray material and it will convert it to a physical material. So once I have all this set up, I'll convert the scene. That usually only takes a couple of seconds. It'll go through, it'll update all the materials in the scene, all the objects, all the lights, all the cameras. It'll remove any legacy data that is not applicable. And now all the cameras are physical cameras, all the lights are correct. The environment is the sun and sky. And now I can work with this in 3ds Max. And if the Revit file updates, I can update the Revit, I can just update that link inside of 3ds Max. And I can do that by going to Manage Links. And here I'll see an indicator that it's updated and I can reload it. Some other improvements are on the modeling side. So when you're modeling, there are times where you'll create a model and you want to add a chamfer. The Chamfer Modifier has been worked on over the last probably 3 or 4 releases pretty heavily. It used to be fairly simple, and now you can set presets. So I can load that preset. That's going to give me this hard edge preset, which I don't really like. Right, so that's that preset. I can come in and just load the default values. So I'm going to set that up. Let's make this 2 segments. I'm going to grab the selected edges. That's going to give me just these edges on the inside here that I can work with. I can adjust how this is setting the distance or the depth of this, right? I can have it fixed. So the fixed is nice because I can go inverted and make a cutout. And then I have this radius bias. Leave that at 0. Leave that at fixed. Let's put this at 0.5 so it's rounded out. I also have options for the type of mitering. And you'll see as I go, quad is the old style, tri, uniform is newer, and then there's this patch. Personally, I like to use uniform. I can create an inset. Right, so I can offset that out or back. Create a little inset there. That gives me a really nice flexible tool to use. I can also adjust and apply different material to the chamfered object or chamfered polygons. And then one last thing that I can do with this, so let me turn off edged faces. And if we look at the shading on this, I'm going to go back to from stack. I'm going to reduce this a little bit. Right, so my shading is pretty clean. If I go to selected edges, I have another tool that I can use called weighted normals. And weighted normals allows you, let's show these. They look like hair coming off of the surface, but the weighted normals allows me to adjust how a surface is shaded. So if I turn that off, you'll see that that shading can be done by angle. I can use smoothing groups. I can have it snap to large faces if I want. But what I generally use is by angle. And here I'll set this to 30 degrees. And that will give me a clean, really nice clean shading on these surfaces. I don't get any artifacts from that. Whereas in the past, there was a possibility of getting these shading artifacts, especially when you're dealing with subdivided surfaces. So I want to show you a couple of resources. So we were talking about V-Ray. V-Ray Next is available for 3ds Max 2021. It's fully compatible. If you are not using 3ds Max 2021 and you're using 3ds Max 2020 or 2019, the Substance Texture version 2 is available from substance3d.com. The 3D warehouse is great for finding SketchUp files. I use this all the time for finding SketchUp files for things.